Okay, now we're going to get into the specific content of the Euthyphro dialogue, and as I mentioned, this will probably take 2 videos, but that's fine. So first, what is the setting here? So this is the ignorant guy from the last video, but that's fine. All right, so what we have happening here is Socrates is sitting on the steps of the court of Athens awaiting his own trial. So he's actually being charged with 3 crimes. I mentioned one in the previous video, and that is making inferior arguments seem the superior. But his other two crimes that he's being charged with. One is making speculations about the heavens. Uh, so what does that mean? Well, Socrates was charged basically with atheism. He was being charged with making speculations about the heavens, which resulted in the rejection of the recognized gods of Athens and then the introduction of new gods. So, I mean, and if you understand the nature of the mythology at the time, where there's a strong correlation between the cultural and societal values of the country or city state you live in, and then the particular gods and goddesses that you serve. To question the nature of the gods is to question the nature of your country. So, since the church and the state are really interwoven here, so to be a loyal citizen of Athens is to be a loyal servant of Athena. And if you're going to come along and even remotely suggest that Athena does not exist in the way that we think Athena exists, I mean, you're questioning the very nature of Athens. You're questioning the very nature of what it means to be a loyal Athenian here. And obviously, if given the context, you can see why that would make people angry. Now, one particular reason why this was such a pressing concern here is that it led to the third charge. And the most serious charge was the charge of corrupting the youth of Athens. Now, why? Well, clearly the youth of Athens are the future leaders of Athens, right? And at this time, Athens had fairly recently had a civil war and was a very young, kind of barely surviving republic. So, and Socrates, you know, would have been a soldier. He would have fought in the Civil War, and a lot of the people in his age group and younger remember the time of the Civil War. So okay, so we've finally overthrown the tyranny. We've finally, gotten rid of all the systems of oppression. We've finally smashed the patriarchy. That would be the equivalent. And now we've just got this budding republic. Things are heading in the right direction. So if Socrates is seen in any kind of way as a threat to that process or that project, and he's bringing up the younger generation in a way that's threatening to the survival of our budding republic. I mean, so it's not easy for us to look back historically and understand what the big deal is, but this would have been a really big deal. Um, I mean, it would have been the equivalent of uh, having certain kinds of views or loyalties in a time of war. Whether it be World War II or the Vietnam War. So why during Vietnam were protesters seen as traitor? That's talk about sedition and treason. Inevitably comes up in those kinds of contexts, largely because people are afraid of losing the status quo. Now, obviously, sometimes people ought to be afraid of losing the status quo, at least if you're maintaining the status quo, and the status quo should be overthrown or overturned. But that's another matter entirely. So, when we look at this old impoverished man just asking people questions and like, well, what are people getting so upset about? I don't get it. I mean, that's part of the context here for why Socrates is being charged with these kinds of crimes. Now, Euthyphro is going to court that day to prosecute his own father for murder. So um, Euthyphro's father saw one servant strike another servant. So Euthyphro's father took the offending servant and bound him and threw him in a ditch, and then went off to seek some kind of divine counsel to know what ought to be done. And in the process, the accused died of exposure. Was just out there in the, the ditch for a while. Um, so Euthyphro says, well, and regardless of who this individual was, regardless of whether or not they were a complete stranger or a member of my own family, what I am doing is a pious action. Justice demands that the evildoer be punished. My father has done evil, um, and what I am doing is a pious action. Now, and in typical Socratic fashion, anytime you're going to use a word or phrase that is vague or ambiguous, Socrates is going to ask, okay, well, what is that? What is piety? So you're saying what you're doing is a pious action. So what are you doing? You are claiming to have knowledge of the pious and the impious, right? So if you're going to say that this action is pious or this action is just or this action is good, you are implicitly claiming to know. You are implicitly claiming to have knowledge of what the pious, the just, and the good are. So let me question you then. Let's let's get to the bottom. Let's engage in some kind of inquiry here to try to discover what the pious, the good, the just actually is here. Okay. Now, in Euthyphro just, kind of takes the bait here. Oh, okay. I'll be able to answer your questions, Socrates. Okay, well, that remains to be seen. Okay, now, so in the progress of the conversation, I'm not going to be going over the entire Euthyphro dialogue in fine combed detail, but what I'm going to hit on here are just certain things that Socrates, that Euthyphro does commit himself to. So initially, um, Socrates asks this question. He says, okay, is not piety in every action always the same? And the same with the impious. So, if a given action is pious and it's made pious by piety, I mean, so the pious and the impious can't sort of overlap with each other, okay? So he's asking if the pious and the impious are opposites. So is not the piety in every action always the same, and the same with the impious? And what does Euthyphro say? Euthyphro says, yes, certainly. So whatever is pious is always pious, whatever is impious is always impious. So piety and impiety have no overlap with each other. They are opposites. Okay. Now, so I'll just phrase it this way. What Euthyphro is committing himself to here is this. He is committing himself to the claim that something cannot be both pious and impious. Okay? Something cannot be both pious and impious. So if the pious and the impious are opposites, if something that is pious is always like itself, the pious, and something that is impious is always like itself, the impious, that means what's pious can't be impious and what's impious can't be pious. And if they're opposites, something can't be both. So if the pious and the impious are opposites, then it's not possible for something to be both pious and impious. So Euthyphro commits himself to that, right? Now, and the kind of first attempt he gives at a definition, but not really, when Socrates asks, okay, well, then explain to me what the pious and the impious are. Euthyphro says this. He says, well, what I am doing is pious. What is pious? Prosecuting my father for murder, making sure that the evildoer is punished, making sure that justice is served. These are examples of pious things. What examples of impious things would be what my father did, binding this servant, and forgetting about him. The impious thievery would be punting kittens would be impious, and Socrates stops him by asking this question. He says, "Well, wait a minute. Isn't it true that there are many pious actions?" And Euthyphro says, well, yeah, there's lots of examples of pious actions. Okay, well, I didn't ask you to give me examples of pious actions. Um, I asked you this. I asked you what piety is. I didn't ask you to give me examples of pious actions. I asked you to explain to me what is the pious. What is piety? Okay, so what would that be? Um, Socrates is asking, what is it in virtue of which that all pious actions are pious? So it's this in virtue of which relation that is so important for Socrates. What he's really asking for is a kind of universal, a property or attribute that distinct things can have in common. So what is it that all pious actions have in common in virtue of which they are pious, right? Now, if we understand that, if we have an understanding of what it is, piety itself, in virtue of which all pious actions are pious, then we will have a way of differentiating between the pious and the impious. So, all pious actions are going to have this thing in common. All impious actions are going to lack that thing. So, knowledge of the pious, knowledge of the universal, piety will give us if not a foolproof way of differentiating between the pious and the impious. So something is pious if it has this attribute, something is impious if it lacks that attribute. That's what we're after here, not a list of pious things. Um, just giving a list of pious things could give you a clue as to what piety is, but giving a list of pious things is not giving a definition of what is pious. So if my child asks me, Daddy, what is a dog? And I say, well, a dog is a thing like a golden retriever, a thing like a poodle, a thing like a Shih Tzu, a German Shepherd, and I just rattle off all of these examples. My child could look at all of the examples and then try to see what they have in common or how they resemble each other, but that's not what my child is asking for. They're asking for a definition. So hopefully my child will stop me and say, well, I'm not interested in examples of dogs. I want to understand dogness, if you will. I want to understand what it is about dogs that makes them dogs as opposed to some other kind of thing. Well, that's basically what we're asking here about the pious and the impious. So the first actual definition that Euthyphro gives is this. And I called it the second definition, but it's the first actual kind of definition. All right. So what is loved by the gods is pious, and what is hated by the gods is going to be impious. So whatever is loved by the gods is pious, and what is hated by the gods is impious. Okay, now, so as a definition, what does that mean? If it's loved by the gods, it's pious, and if it's pious, it's loved by the gods. If it's hated by the gods, it's impious, and if it's impious, it's hated by the gods. Okay. Okay, and Socrates kind of says, "Well, bravo, you gave me exactly what I want here. And, that's what I'm looking for." Okay, but then Socrates points this out. He says, "But isn't there war among the gods?" He talks about the fact that the gods disagree with each other. They differ in what they love and hate, and what could cause the gods to quarrel about these kinds of things. He says, so I mean, so if you and I have a disagreement about a unit of measurement, won't we just find a way of settling the difference? So if you and I are disagreeing about how high the ceiling is here in the kids playroom, which is where my desk is, this is kind of my office, if you will. If you and I disagree on the height of the ceiling in this room, I mean, can't we just measure it and settle that difference once and for all? And would such a disagreement really cause us to quarrel and be at war with each other? No, absolutely not. Okay, so what kinds of disagreements could the gods and goddesses actually have that would cause them to be at war with each other and to quarrel so much and to thwart each other's plans and to act really petulantly towards each other? Um, isn't it because they disagree on what is good and just and pious and those kinds of things? Euthyphro says, well, yeah, certainly. You know, uh, so when it comes to a disagreement about the height of a ceiling, we'll just measure it and, oh, I stand corrected. You actually know more about the height of my own ceiling than I do, even though I purchased this house and you're just watching a YouTube video. Oh, okay. I'm not going to quarrel with you about that. I'm not that, self-centered or narcissistic or whatever. No, but so if the gods are having these significant disagreements to the extent where they're willing to, I mean, they would kill each other if they could. It's a good thing they're all immortal because they can't, but they would if they could. It has to be disagreements about the good and the just and those kinds of things. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that means that a given course of action would be loved by one god and another course of action would be hated by another god. Okay. Now, so it's here that we get an inconsistent set. Okay. So keep in mind, Euthyphro has already committed himself to this. Something cannot be both pious and impious. Okay. He's already committed himself to this idea that the pious and the impious are opposites, so something cannot be both. And the definition of piety and impiety, again, are what is loved by the gods is pious and what is hated by the gods is impious. Okay? Now, but it's also true that things are both God loved and God hated. Okay? So, if it is true that what is loved by the gods is pious and what is hated by the gods is impious, and it is also true that things are both God loved and God hated. So take any given state of affairs, some gods will love it, some gods will hate it. Take any given course of action, some gods will love it, some gods will hate it. So things are both God loved and God hated. Well, that means things can be both pious and impious, right? Okay, so just to rehash here. So we have something cannot be both pious and impious. What is loved by the gods is pious, and what is hated by the gods is impious. And things are both God loved and God hated. Well, on the basis of A, B, and C, we can derive that things can be both pious and impious, right? But doesn't that contradict A? Yes, it does. So from A, B, and C, we can derive things can be both pious and impious, but that contradicts A. So what does that tell us? That tells us that A, B, and C is an inconsistent set. Not all of these claims can be true. Okay? So from A, B, and C, on the assumption that A, B, and C are all true, we derive a contradiction, which means that A, B, and C can't all be true. What we have here is an inconsistent set. Okay? Now, so what are Euthyphro's kinds of options here? So Socrates doesn't take him through all of the options, so let's just pretend that Socrates did, all right? So let's go back and look at these claims again. So since we know that A, B, and C is an inconsistent set, that means that at least one of them is going to be false. Now, and not only does at least one of them have to be false, we also know that the truth of any two of them is going to imply that the third one is false. Okay, so if A and B are true, C has to be false. If A and C are true, B has to be false. And if B and C are true, A has to be false. Okay, so what are some of the options that Euthyphro has here? Okay, he could reject A. Okay, now, and what would that mean? So Euthyphro is claiming to have certain knowledge of what is pious. So if he were to give up the claim that something cannot be both pious and impious, what would that mean? So he would be saying, I am certain that what I'm doing is pious. But then he would also say, however, it's just as likely that it would be impious. Now, if you say, well, I'm certain, but it's also true that I could be mistaken. So I am certain that what I am doing is pious. However, I could be mistaken and it could be impious. Doesn't that mean you're not certain? Right? What does it mean to be certain about something? To be certain about something means you can't possibly be mistaken about it. So if you admit that you could be mistaken about it, and it's true that you could be mistaken about it, that means that you're not certain. Now, so if Euthyphro were to give up on claim A, if he were to give up on the claim that something cannot be both pious and impious, then he can't claim confident, certain knowledge that what he's doing is actually pious, because he would have to admit that it's just as likely that it would be impious. So if Euthyphro were to give up on A, he would be undermining his own position. He'd be undermining his own claim. That would be the equivalent of sawing his own legs off to do a better job running the race. That would just be absolutely absurd. So Euthyphro can't give up on A. Now, again, Socrates doesn't present that option. Okay, out of these claims A, B, and C, which one do you want to give up on? Okay, but that's what we're doing here. Okay, well, what if he gives up on B? Or, I'm sorry, what if he gives up on C? Things are both God loved and God hated. Well, that's just a descriptive claim about the nature of the gods. And as an expert in religion who knows the mythology and knows the nature of the gods, it's abundantly clear to Euthyphro that there is war among the gods. So if he were to say, no, things aren't both God loved and God hated, he would be undermining his own claims to know the nature of the gods. I mean, anybody who has even introductory knowledge of Greek mythology, yeah, knows that there's discord among the gods. I mean, we've all heard the stories, right? Okay, so since A and C are safe from criticism, the only option that Euthyphro has is to reject B. He has to reject this definition that what is loved by the gods is pious and what is hated by the gods is impious. Now, again, so Socrates doesn't take him through those options. He doesn't say, okay, well, you can't reject A because then you'll be undermining your own claim with certainty. You can't reject C because that's just a claim about the nature of God and kinds of you know quibbles that they have and discord that they have among each other. So if you affirm A and C, and A, B, and C is an inconsistent set, if you affirm A and C, the only option is to reject B. And that is exactly what Euthyphro does here. Okay? All right. Now, so that gets us into the next definition, and here I'm gonna go ahead and cut this video off and just go ahead and do a second video. I want to keep this a little bit shorter. Okay, so after Euthyphro says, okay, well, I guess you're right, Socrates, that piety and impiety cannot be defined by what is loved by the gods and what is hated by the gods, respectively. Euthyphro says, okay, but even if the gods disagree on other things, some of them love the Trojan War, some of them hate it. I can understand why there would be discord among them with respect to that. They all agree on this one thing. So they all agree that the murderers should be punished. They all agree on that. There wouldn't possibly be any disagreement among them about that. And Socrates says, okay, well, even if that's true, what you need to do is substantiate the claim that they all agree that this instance of what you're doing actually involves prosecuting a murderer. So even if it is true that the gods all agree that the murderer ought to be prosecuted, that doesn't necessarily mean that they all agree that what your father did constitutes murder. So how are you going to substantiate that claim? So on what basis do you know that all the gods, even if we just grant that they all agree that the murderer should be punished, that the murderer should be prosecuted, how do you know they all agree about this specific instance? How have you surveyed all of the gods? Have you interviewed all the gods? Have you asked every single god whether they agree that the claim that the prosecutor ought to be, or the murderer ought to be prosecuted, not the prosecutor ought to be murdered, that would be bad, that the murderer ought to be prosecuted? Can you really affirm that they all agree that it counts in this case? I mean, you really can't, but Socrates is like, okay, I'll give you that. Let's say that all the gods agree that what you're doing right now is pious, that what you're doing right now is just and good, and all of that. Okay, so shall we amend the definition then? Here's the third definition. So what is loved by all the gods is pious, and what is hated by all the gods is impious. So before it's piety is what's loved by the gods, impiety is what's hated by the gods. Now it's piety is what is loved by all the gods, and impiety is what is hated by all gods. Okay, now this definition might seem as though it's the exact same one as before, but it is actually not. So logically, there is a difference between saying what all the or with between saying piety is what the gods love and piety is what all the gods love. So there is a difference between saying piety is what the gods love and piety is what all the gods love. All right, so here's an analogous case. So cats have four legs. That is true. That is true as a general claim about cats. However, all cats have four legs is false. So if a cat is missing a leg, that doesn't mean it's no longer a cat. Or if a cat has one of its legs removed through a medical procedure, the fact that it's now a three-legged cat doesn't mean it's no longer a cat. So as a general claim about cats, it is true that cats typically have four legs. So as a general claim about the gods, it's just generally true that the gods love what is pious. That's just the nature of the pious. The gods love it. But saying all the gods love it, logically that is different. So the whole point is logically, if these statements were equivalent, if these kinds of statements were equivalent, either they would both be true or they would both be false. But since one of them is true and the other one is false, that means there is a logical difference between them. Okay. Now, so this definition as piety is what all the gods love and impiety is what all the gods hate, this is not subject to the same kind of criticism that the previous um, definition was. Why? Because now we don't have the worry about some things being God loved and some things being God hated. That would not apply. So if all the gods love something or all the gods hate something, then there's no discord among them about what they love and hate. So the problem with this definition, if there is a problem, is going to be something different than there being an inconsistency with things being both pious and impious. So if there's something that the gods disagree on, it's either impious or it's just morally neutral in that respect. So if this definition has a problem, it's going to have a completely different kind of problem than the previous definition does. Okay? All right, so, and that is where we will pick things up in the next video.